My brother texted me late at night stating his two kids were coming over the next morning and telling me to watch them. I replied that I was not home. He answered that it did not matter because our mother gave him my spare keys. I did not argue. I quietly called a locksmith, changed every lock on my doors, and alerted my neighborhood security team. The next morning he arrived with his two children, and panicked when two armed officers were already standing outside waiting for him. My name is Maya. I am 33 years old, and for my entire life, my family treated me like their designated servant, and a perpetual disappointment. They had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who grossly underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I dismantled their entire reality. I was standing in my kitchen sipping a warm matcha latte when the violent pounding on my front door began. The heavy thuds echoed through the high ceilings of my foyer. Marcus was out there furious that his stolen key was useless against my new deadbolts. He pounded harder, rattling the custom glass panels. "You always do this, Maya," he yelled, his voice easily carrying through the thick mahogany door. "Mom said you need to start acting like a real aunt, since you clearly are not having your own kids anytime soon. Open this door right now. My tea time at the country club is in 20 minutes, and I am not missing it just because you want to be stubborn." I took another slow sip of my matcha, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat. His sense of entitlement was suffocating, but entirely predictable. As the older brother and the undisputed golden child of our family, Mark had spent his entire 36 years believing the world existed solely to cater to his schedule. My parents, Evelyn and Richard, fostered that delusion at every turn. To them, my single and child-free status meant my time was inherently worthless, and therefore belonged entirely to my brother and his white wife, Chloe. I did not move to open the door. Instead, I watched the live feed from my doorbell camera on my tablet. Marcus was violently jiggling the brass handle, his face contorted with rage, while his two young children stood behind him, looking utterly exhausted by their father's tantrum. Before he could raise his fist to pound on the wood again, a white patrol vehicle pulled smoothly into my driveway. Two uniformed neighborhood security officers stepped out onto the pristine paving stones. They approached the porch with their hands resting casually near their belts. Marcus spun around, his arrogant expression instantly melting into defensive panic as the officers asked him to step away from the entrance. "What is your problem?" Marcus demanded, attempting to puff up his chest and assert dominance over the guards. "I am dropping my kids off at my sister's house. I practically own this place anyway. My parents paid her down payment. Tell her to open the door." The sheer audacity of his lie made me set my mug down. It was the same lie he and my mother paraded around their church friends to explain how a single black woman like me could afford a luxury home in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Atlanta. They convinced everyone that my parents had subsidized my life. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch holding a crisp legal folder. The cool morning air hit my face, but my blood was boiling. I looked at the security officers and then shifted my gaze to my brother. "Actually, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "Mom and Dad did not pay my down payment. They did not contribute a single dime to this property." I opened the folder and handed a certified copy of the deed to the nearest officer. "As you can see, gentlemen, I am the sole owner of this residence, and this man is trespassing." Marcus scoffed loudly, trying to brush off my statement. "Maya, stop being dramatic and take the kids. You owe this family after everything Mom and Dad sacrificed for your college tuition. You dropped out and they still supported you." I stepped closer to him, closing the distance. My voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper that only he and the officers could hear. "I left a mediocre state school because I earned a full academic ride to a top-tier Ivy League business program, Marcus. That was a fact you and Mom conveniently erased from the family narrative because it outshone your failing grades. But since we are talking about who owes whom, let us talk about your house." Marcus crossed his arms, smirking as if I could not possibly touch him. "My house is in a gated community, Maya. I am doing just fine. You are living in a house owned by our parents. I corrected him loudly enough for the officers to hear, and the only reason the bank did not foreclose on that house last month is because I personally paid the mortgage arrears. I am the one currently paying the mortgage on their house to keep you and Mom out of foreclosure. You do not own anything. You are drowning in debt and using my parents as a shield. The color completely drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The security officers exchanged a quick glance, clearly understanding the power dynamic had completely shifted. Now take your kids and get off my property before I press criminal trespassing charges. I told him, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. This was only the absolute beginning. Get out. Less than 4 hours after the police escorted my brother off my front porch, my phone screen lit up with a rigid summons. It was a formal calendar invite from my mother, dictating a mandatory lunch at the Oakmont Country Club. They did not ask if I was available or if I was willing to speak with them. They simply expected me to abandon my day, appear at their favorite pretentious table, and accept my reprimand, like an obedient subordinate. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a tailored emerald suit that cost more than my mother's entire annual country club membership fee. The hostess led me to a private shaded terrace overlooking the meticulously manicured 18th hole. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, were already seated. Next to them sat Chloe, my 32-year-old white sister-in-law. She wore a pristine tennis skirt and sipped a mimosa, looking entirely too pleased with herself. Marcus was noticeably absent. He was likely off playing a round of golf while sending his wife and his parents to do his dirty work. I took my seat without offering a single apology for the morning events. Chloe lazily stirred her drink, letting the ice clink loudly against the crystal glass. She offered me a tight, highly patronizing smile that did not reach her eyes. Maya, we know you have always had a massive chip on your shoulder because Marcus got the business loans from your parents and you did not. She tilted her head, adopting a tone of faux sympathy. But as a black woman in corporate America, you should really be grateful you even have a decent desk job. We need you to step up and watch the kids on the weekends, so Marcus can focus entirely on his startup. It is about building generational wealth, Maya. You should want to support your successful brother instead of calling neighborhood security on him like some unhinged thug. Her words hung in the humid air, dripping with weaponized privilege and blatant disrespect. She sat there genuinely believing that my sole existence was meant to facilitate her husband's imaginary success. She completely ignored the glaring fact that my parents had blindly handed Marcus nearly $500,000 to launch a tech company that had produced absolutely nothing in 3 years. Meanwhile, I was aggressively denied a meager $50,000 loan for my own initial business plan, because my father explicitly told me that commercial real estate was a man's game, and I should focus on finding a husband. My mother leaned forward, resting her heavily manicured hands on the crisp white tablecloth. Chloe is absolutely right, Maya. Your behavior this morning was entirely unacceptable and deeply embarrassing. You humiliated your own brother in front of your new neighbors. We are a family and family shares resources without question. Since you are single and have all that extra space in your unnecessarily large new house, we have decided it makes the most practical sense for Marcus to use it. My father nodded vigorously in agreement, cutting his steak with precise and aggressive motions. Marcus desperately needs a quiet professional environment for his high-level investor meetings. His current home is far too loud with the children running around. You will give him the new spare keys by tomorrow morning. He will use your master suite as his primary home office during the week. You can easily stay in the smaller guest room. Do not be selfish about this, Maya. We expect you to cooperate. I sat back in my chair and stared at the three of them, letting the sheer magnitude of their delusion wash over me. They truly believed they could casually commandeer the luxury home I bought with my own hard-earned money simply because Marcus asked for it. They viewed my life, my personal space, and my valuable time as public property for the golden child to claim whenever he pleased. They wanted to shrink my world so Marcus could expand his. Chloe smiled smugly, taking another long sip of her mimosa. It will be so good for you, Maya. You can help out with the boys when they get out of school. It will give you a real sense of purpose outside of shuffling papers at whatever little desk job you have right now. Plus, Marcus can keep an eye on the property and make sure you are maintaining it properly. I reached slowly into my designer handbag. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or frustration. I simply pulled out my wallet and extracted a sleek, heavy black Centurion card. I placed it gently onto the center of the table. The dull, heavy thud of the solid titanium card against the polished wood caught my father's attention immediately. His eyes widened in absolute shock, recognizing the exclusive invitation, only credit card, reserved strictly for individuals with astronomical net worths. I flagged down the waiter, handing him the card to cover my single glass of iced tea. Then I turned my undivided attention back to my smug sister-in-law. Marcus does not have a startup, Chloe. I said, my voice perfectly smooth and utterly lethal. He has a failing limited liability company with exactly $400,000 in unrecoverable debt. And I do not have a desk job. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Real Estate Development. I watched the color rapidly drain from Chloe's face as her smug smile vanished. My parents sat completely frozen in their chairs, unable to comprehend the devastating words coming out of my mouth. In fact, Chloe, I just bought the Platinum Commercial Building downtown. Yes, the exact luxury building where Marcus rents his current office space. You can tell him his rent goes up 300% on the first of the month. Make sure he pays on time, because late fees will be strictly enforced this upcoming year. I watched the color completely drain from Chloe's face as my words settled over the country club table. Marcus stared at me with his mouth hanging open, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my suit, and walked right out of the dining room. I assumed they would slink away in shame. I underestimated their capacity for weaponized victimhood. By the time I reached my office the next morning, my phone vibrated continuously. My assistant Sarah knocked on my door and handed me an iPad. "You need to see this," she said, her expression tense. On the screen was Chloe sitting in what looked like a perfectly curated nursery. Her makeup was artfully smudged to look as though she had been crying for hours. I pressed play, and Chloe's trembling voice filled my office. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," she sniffled, looking directly into the camera. "But my sister-in-law Maya has decided to target my family. She bought the building where my husband runs his business and immediately raised his rent by 300%. She is an angry, unhinged woman, and she is actively trying to force my mixed-race nephews onto the street." The video already had 200,000 views. The comments were a cesspool of strangers calling me a monster, a corporate villain, and a disgrace to my community. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She was playing the fragile, tearful white woman being victimized by the aggressive, successful black woman. It was a calculated performance designed to incite a mob. The screen cut to a new clip within the same video. Chloe dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "We have always been so supportive of Maya. We tried to help her when she was a struggling college dropout, and this is how she repays us. She just resents us because Marcus is a traditional provider." I paused the video. A struggling college dropout. That was the fabricated narrative my family had clung to for over a decade. When I was 19, I realized the local state school my parents forced me to attend lacked the rigorous business program I needed. I quietly applied to a top-tier Ivy League university and was accepted with a full academic scholarship. I left the state school to pack my bags for Pennsylvania. Instead of being proud, my parents were furious that I had defied their plan. They told everyone I dropped out because I could not handle the coursework. They completely erased my Ivy League degree from their reality, because acknowledging it meant admitting I had outpaced Marcus, who took 6 years to finish a basic communications degree. Now Chloe was broadcasting that lie to millions of strangers on the internet, using it to validate her smear campaign. My desk phone rang, piercing the silence in my office. The caller identification displayed my mother's cell phone number. I took a deep breath and answered. "Maya," Evelyn shouted before I could even say hello. "What is wrong with you? My country club friends are sending me links to this video. Do you have any idea how bad this makes Chloe look in front of her social circle? You are embarrassing our entire family on the internet." I leaned back in my leather chair. Mom, Chloe posted the video herself. She is the one broadcasting her husband's financial failures. My mother refused to listen. You brought this on yourself by acting like a corporate tyrant. Marcus is your brother. He is trying to build generational wealth for his sons, and you are stepping on his neck. You will log on to whatever app this is, and issue a public apology to Chloe immediately. Then you will draw up a new lease for Marcus. He gets the office space rent-free for the next 2 years. That is the only way to fix the public relations nightmare you caused. I let her finish her ridiculous demands. You want me to subsidize a failing business and apologize to a woman who just defamed me to 250,000 people. I asked, my voice perfectly calm. That is not going to happen, Mom. In fact, Marcus has exactly 30 days to vacate my property. I disconnected the call while she was mid-sentence. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I picked up my cell phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. It was time to show Chloe what an unhinged woman with a legal team could actually accomplish. I instructed my lawyer to bypass the standard cease and desist letter. We were moving straight to scorched earth. I knew Chloe hosted a daily lifestyle stream at noon from her lavish influencer studio, which was located in a guest house on their property. At exactly 12:15, I opened a burner social media account and joined her live feed. She was demonstrating a skincare routine to 4,000 viewers, acting as though her tearful breakdown from yesterday had never happened. I typed a single message into the chat. Look out your window, Chloe. A moment later, the camera captured the sound of heavy knocking. Chloe frowned and walked her phone over to the window. Standing on her manicured lawn was a process server accompanied by a local sheriff. Chloe opened the door, still broadcasting to her followers. Ma'am, the server announced loudly. You are being served with an immediate eviction notice for the commercial property Marcus operates downtown. Furthermore, you are being served with a municipal citation. This influencer studio is an unpermitted commercial operation running in a strictly residential zone. The city has ordered you to cease all business activities immediately or face criminal fines. I watched Chloe drop her expensive moisturizer as panic overtook her perfectly contoured face. Her followers flooded the chat with confused questions. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus, but I quickly silenced it. Let him panic. By Tuesday morning, his panic had morphed into desperate, calculated retaliation. A process server intercepted me outside my office building, dropping a thick manila envelope into my hands before speeding off. Marcus was suing me. The lawsuit was an absolute masterpiece of fiction, claiming I had illicitly funneled funds from our late grandfather's trust to build Apex real estate development. He demanded an immediate freeze on all my personal assets, a reversal of the commercial eviction notices, and full executive control of my company. 72 hours later, we sat in a sterile glass-walled conference room at a premier downtown mediation firm. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, but Marcus was already sweating through his tailored suit. Chloe sat beside him, glaring at me with venomous intensity. Her online influencer persona was entirely shattered after my livestream, and she clearly viewed this lawsuit as her ultimate redemption. Across the polished oak table sat my parents, Richard and Evelyn. They formed a united front of rigid disapproval, treating me like a common criminal who had just been caught red-handed. My lead counsel, Jordan, sat quietly to my right, organizing our files with calculated precision. The mediator, an older man named Richard Sterling, adjusted his glasses and reviewed the initial complaint Marcus had filed. Marcus cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie, projecting the image of an aggrieved businessman. Maya systematically drained the trust fund our grandfather established before his death. He stated, his voice dripping with rehearsed indignation. She used generations of family wealth to build her little real estate empire and deliberately cut me out of the profits. She is now using that stolen wealth to terrorize my wife and children. My father slammed his heavy fist onto the table, making the crystal water glasses rattle violently. Your grandfather meant that money for the male heir to carry on the family name, Maya. You manipulated a sick old man on his deathbed to steal your brother's birthright. You have always been incredibly greedy and unnatural. Women do not behave this way. I looked directly at my father, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. I spent 2 solid years driving to the hospice facility every single evening to bathe him, feed him, and manage his medical affairs, while Marcus was busy taking luxury vacations to Cabo on your dime. Grandpa saw exactly who the responsible adult in this family was. He knew his legacy would be pawned off to pay for sports cars if he left it to your precious son. My mother gasped, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. How dare you speak to your father that way? Marcus is the man of this family. He is building a legacy for his sons. You are just a bitter single woman trying to destroy her own flesh and blood out of pure spite because you are utterly alone. Marcus smiled, sensing his moment to strike. He reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper enclosed in a plastic protective sleeve. He slid it across the table to the mediator with a theatrical flourish. I am not just asking for financial equity, Mr. Sterling. I am asserting my legal right to assume immediate control of her assets. That is a power of attorney document signed and notarized by my grandfather exactly 2 days before he died. It grants me full executive control over any and all business entities created using his trust funds. I demand immediate control of Apex Real Estate Development and a reversal of all property evictions. Mr. Sterling picked up the document. He read it silently, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. He looked at Jordan, then at me, his expression shifting to one of genuine legal concern. The document looked highly authentic at first glance. It possessed the heavy legal cardstock, the official notary seal, and a signature that strongly resembled my grandfather's shaky cursive handwriting. If this document holds up in probate court, Mr. Sterling warned, adjusting his posture, Marcus would indeed have strong grounds to initiate a hostile takeover of your firm, pending a full financial audit of your initial startup capital. Chloe let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. Looks like you are going to be the one looking for a new office space, Maya. Maybe you can find a nice cubicle somewhere in the suburbs. Just make sure you hand over those keys before security escorts you out of your own building. My parents beamed with absolute pride, looking at Marcus as if he had just won a Nobel Prize. They genuinely believed they had cornered me. They thought their golden boy had finally put the unruly, defiant daughter back in her proper place. They fully expected me to panic, to cry, or to beg for a settlement to save my company. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I simply opened the black leather portfolio resting in front of me. I pulled out a thick, professionally bound document with a certified forensic accounting seal stamped on the front cover. I slid it smoothly across the oak table until it stopped right in front of Mr. Sterling. Let me clarify something for the room, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a surgical blade. Grandpa did not leave me a massive pile of cash, Marcus. He left me a bankrupt limited liability company with $60,000 in federal tax liens and a crumbling residential duplex. I legally assumed the debt, paid off the liens with my corporate salary over 3 years, and flipped the property to seed my first major commercial investment. There was no liquid trust fund money. You are fighting to the death for control of a phantom account. Marcus sneered, his face flushing a deep, angry red. You are lying. You hid the money offshore. You are a thief, Maya. I smiled coldly, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. But since we are so deeply interested in scrutinizing family financial records today, let us talk about the forensic audit my team completed yesterday afternoon. I tapped the thick report sitting in front of the mediator. Page 42 is particularly fascinating. It details a massive offshore wire transfer that occurred exactly 14 months ago. I shifted my gaze to my parents, watching their confused, angry expressions before locking eyes with Marcus again. Let us talk about the $250,000 you secretly wired out of Mom and Dad's retirement account last year, using a forged digital signature. You systematically siphoned away their entire life savings to cover your disastrous crypto margin calls. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of gray, his eyes darting frantically between me and the thick forensic report on the table. Evelyn dropped her designer handbag entirely, the heavy clasp clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. They had spent their entire lives treating me like the ultimate villain, ignoring every red flag, Marcus ever waved in their faces. Now the absolute truth was sitting right in front of them, bound in professional legal formatting and backed by irrefutable banking data. I paused, letting the absolute horror wash over my parents' faces as the reality of my words settled into their brains. Shall I show them the routing numbers, Marcus, or will you? Marcus opened his mouth, but only a pathetic stammering sound emerged. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson as the trap completely closed around him. My father snatched the forensic report from the table, his hands trembling so violently, the thick pages rattled against the polished oak. Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a muffled gasp as she stared at her golden boy. They had spent my entire life shielding him from the consequences of his own mediocrity, and now they were staring at the cold, hard proof that he had repaid their blind loyalty by financially gutting them. I did not wait for Marcus to formulate another lie. I stood up, smoothed the front of my emerald suit, and nodded to the mediator. I walked out of the glass-walled conference room, leaving them to cannibalize each other over their missing retirement funds. The fabricated power of attorney was dead on arrival, and my empire remained entirely untouched. It took Chloe exactly 3 weeks to orchestrate her desperate public relations rehabilitation. Her lucrative influencer career was bleeding sponsors at a catastrophic rate after her illegal zoning citations became public knowledge. To salvage her shattered image, she aggressively maneuvered herself into the chair position for the annual Crystal Hope Charity Gala. The event was dedicated to raising funds for underprivileged youth in the inner city. The hypocrisy was absolutely staggering. A woman who gleefully attempted to render a successful Black female business owner homeless was now masquerading in designer couture as a benevolent savior for marginalized children. I knew she was using the event to secure her social standing among the local elite, pretending her life was perfectly intact despite her husband's impending financial ruin. I decided it was time to participate in her little charity project. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel. I arrived precisely an hour after the doors officially opened. I wore a custom floor-length crimson silk gown that demanded attention with every step. Diamonds glittered at my throat and my posture projected absolute authority. As I stepped into the opulent marble foyer, my presence sent immediate ripples through the affluent crowd. Waiters carrying trays of crystal champagne flutes paused, and prominent business leaders turned their heads to watch me walk in. Chloe spotted me almost instantly from across the room. She was wearing a heavily beaded silver gown that looked rigid and uncomfortable. Her artificial smile dropped, immediately replaced by a look of sheer panic and unadulterated rage. She marched toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She frantically flagged down 2 massive security guards stationed near an elaborate ice sculpture, pointing a manicured finger directly at me. "What are you doing here, Maya?" Chloe hissed, keeping her voice low but trembling with fury. She turned sharply to the security guards blocking my path. "This woman is not on the guest list. She is a known trespasser with a highly documented history of causing violent, aggressive scenes at our private family events. When she was in her 20s, she completely ruined our Thanksgiving dinner, screaming like a lunatic that my husband stole her car. He simply borrowed it for a few days to get to work without asking her first, and she called the police on her own blood. She is mentally unstable, dangerous, and holding a grudge. Remove her from this venue immediately before I call the authorities myself." The 2 security guards stepped forward, their expressions hardening as they prepared to physically escort me out. I did not take a single step back. I smoothed the silk of my crimson gown and met Chloe's panicked gaze with a cold, steady stare. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted my parents standing near the champagne fountain. Evelyn nudged Richard, and they both deliberately turned their backs to me, pretending to be deeply engrossed in the string quartet playing softly in the corner. They were completely willing to stand by and watch their daughter be physically thrown out of a high society event, just to protect Chloe's fragile ego and maintain their illusion of perfection. Marcus sauntered over, holding a glass of expensive bourbon. He looked exhausted and slightly haggard, likely from the immense fallout of his stolen retirement fund scandal, but he still managed to muster a pathetic, arrogant sneer. "You heard her. Maya Marcus laughed, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. You do not belong in this tax bracket, and you certainly do not belong at a VIP charity event. Take an Uber back to reality before they put you in handcuffs and ruin your little corporate reputation. One of the security guards reached out a heavy hand toward my arm. Before his fingers could even graze my silk sleeve, a panicked voice echoed across the crowded foyer. Stop right there. Get your hands away from her right now. The head event organizer, a short, frantic man named Julian, sprinted across the marble floor, his face flushed red and covered in a sheen of terrified sweat. He shoved the two massive security guards backward with surprising force, nearly knocking one off balance. Are you completely out of your minds? Julian shrieked at the guards before turning to me with a look of absolute horror. Ms. Wilson, I am so incredibly sorry. I had absolutely no idea you had arrived yet. We have your VIP table waiting right by the stage. Please accept my deepest apologies for this unacceptable mix-up. Chloe scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her beaded gown. Julian, what are you doing? She is trespassing. I am the chair of this gala, and I demand you have her thrown out immediately. Julian shot Chloe a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, completely ignoring her command. He grabbed my elbow gently and guided me toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. The crowd parted for us, murmuring in confusion as we bypassed the security detail. Julian rushed up the carpeted stairs and snatched the microphone from the acrylic podium. The feedback whined sharply, instantly silencing the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian announced, his voice booming through the massive speakers and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. There has been a brief, unfortunate misunderstanding at the door tonight. Please direct your undivided attention to the stage and join me in welcoming the remarkable woman who single-handedly saved tonight's event from cancellation. Let us give a massive round of applause to our exclusive platinum sponsor, whose staggering $500,000 donation made this entire gala possible, Miss Maya Wilson. The ballroom erupted into deafening applause. I walked gracefully up the stairs and took my place at the podium. I looked down into the crowd and locked eyes with Chloe, watching her entire world crumble into dust. The brilliant spotlight hit my face, casting a warm glow over my crimson silk gown. Below me, a sea of affluent donors smiled and raised their crystal champagne flutes, completely unaware of the absolute storm I was about to unleash. I gripped the sides of the acrylic podium, letting the thunderous applause wash over the room before raising my hand to request silence. The clapping subsided, replaced by an eager hush. Thank you, Julian, for that incredibly generous introduction. I began, my voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. It is truly an honor to stand before so many esteemed members of our community tonight. We are all gathered here under the noble pretense of helping those less fortunate. We are here to open our checkbooks and our hearts to the underprivileged youth of this city. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the front row until it landed squarely on my parents. Evelyn was gripping Richard's arm so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. Their faces were drained of all color, terrified of what I might say next. Growing up, I was taught that charity starts at home. I continued, keeping my tone conversational but razor sharp. In my family, my brother Marcus always received the absolute best life had to offer. Luxury cars straight out of high school, fully paid college tuition, despite his consistently failing grades, and even quiet bail money when his fraternity parties got entirely out of hand. My parents spared absolutely no expense to ensure his comfort. So it is no surprise to me that Chloe's charity is meticulously designed to keep that rich family tradition alive and well. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the grand ballroom. Wealthy socialites exchanged bewildered glances. This was not the standard congratulatory speech they were accustomed to hearing at a $5,000 a plate dinner. At the edge of the room, Chloe snapped out of her paralyzed state. Her face twisted into a mask of pure panic. She frantically waved her arms at the audio-visual booth located on the balcony level, slashing her hand across her throat in a desperate gesture to cut my microphone. When the sound engineer did not immediately comply, Chloe hiked up the heavy beaded skirt of her silver gown and began sprinting toward the back of the ballroom, pushing past bewildered guests and waiters. She was entirely too late. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. I glanced up at the sound booth and offered a slight nod. Standing directly behind the soundboard, arms crossed over her chest, was my lead corporate attorney, along with my fiercely loyal assistant Sarah. They had legally rented the venue space directly adjacent to the control room and presented the hotel management with a rock-solid injunction guaranteeing my uninterrupted stage time. Chloe pounded furiously on the locked glass door of the booth, but my microphone remained perfectly live. When I decided to make my $500,000 donation, I did what any responsible business owner does. I announced, raising my voice slightly to command the shifting room. I instructed my team to conduct a thorough forensic audit of the Crystal Hope Foundation. What we discovered was not a network of after-school programs or community outreach centers. What we found was a masterclass in financial deception. I tapped the small remote resting on the podium. The massive twin projection screens flanking the stage flickered to life. The decorative charity logos vanished instantly, replaced by high-resolution scans of complex tax filings, banking routing numbers, and corporate registration documents. As you can see clearly projected behind me, 90% of the donations collected tonight are not going to underprivileged youth, I declared, pointing to the highlighted figures on the screen. They are being instantly routed to a private strategic consulting firm, a firm registered to an anonymous post office box in Delaware, a firm completely owned and operated by my brother Marcus. The collective gasp from the audience was absolutely deafening. Over 500 of the most powerful and influential people in the city stared at the screens in unadulterated horror. I highlighted the next document, putting the final nail in their proverbial coffin. "This is not a charity gala, ladies and gentlemen," I stated, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "This is a high society GoFundMe, explicitly designed to cover my brother's escalating offshore gambling debts. The very same debts that caused him to secretly drain my parents' entire retirement savings last year. You are not buying textbooks for children tonight. You are paying off illicit loan sharks and funding an illegal commercial influencer studio." The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Furious donors began standing up from their tables, demanding immediate answers. A prominent local judge seated near the front threw his napkin onto his plate in disgust and pointed a furious finger directly at Marcus. Marcus was completely trapped, surrounded by outraged socialites and powerful investors who realized they had just been conned out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. He shrunk back into his chair, pulling at his collar as if he were suddenly suffocating. My parents were frozen in a state of unparalleled humiliation. The very country club friends Evelyn had desperately tried to impress were now looking at her with open revulsion. The carefully curated illusion of the perfect wealthy family was completely annihilated, broadcast in high definition for the entire elite circle to witness. Evelyn buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, while Richard stared blankly at the tax documents on the screen, his precious legacy effectively destroyed by his own golden child. Up in the balcony, Chloe slumped against the glass of the audio-visual booth, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor. Her designer gown pooled around her in a pathetic heap. She covered her ears, trying to block out the angry shouts echoing from the ballroom floor, but there was no escaping the reality of her choices. She had tried to leverage a fake charity to save her crumbling status, and instead she had publicly immolated her entire life. I stood at the podium for a moment longer, absorbing the beautiful chaos I had orchestrated. I did not need to raise my voice or resort to petty name-calling. I simply let the undeniable truth do the heavy lifting. I stepped away from this microphone, leaving the undeniable evidence glowing brightly on the massive screens. As I gracefully descended the stage stairs, the outraged crowd naturally parted for me, offering me a clear, unobstructed path toward the exit. I had completely dismantled their fake reality, and I had done it wearing a stunning custom gown. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office at Apex Real Estate Development, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. I stood calmly sipping my black coffee and watching the local news on the muted television screen mounted on the far wall. The media fallout from the Crystal Hope Charity Gala was absolute and merciless. Pundits were already dubbing it the most egregious philanthropic fraud in the city's history. My personal cell phone and my office lines had been ringing incessantly with calls from prominent investors, local politicians, and furious donors, completely severing ties with Marcus and Chloe. I felt a profound sense of peace watching their empire of lies burn to the ground. The intercom on my mahogany desk buzzed sharply, breaking the quiet satisfaction of my morning routine. My executive assistant spoke, her voice laced with professional concern and a hint of alarm. "Ms. Wilson, your mother is down in the main lobby. She completely bypassed the reception desk and is currently screaming at the security guards. She is demanding to see you immediately. Shall I have her officially escorted out of the building?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "No. Send her up. Let us see exactly what she wants." Less than 2 minutes later, my heavy double oak doors flew open with a violent crash. Evelyn stumbled into my office looking like a woman who had just survived a high-speed collision. Her expensive designer trench coat was misbuttoned, her signature immaculate hair was a frizzy, tangled mess, and her face was streaked with dark running mascara. She slammed the door shut behind her and immediately burst into loud, dramatic sobs. It was not the genuine weeping of a mother who had realized the error of her ways. It was the frantic, terrified panic of a woman whose carefully constructed house of cards had just collapsed directly on top of her. "Maya, you have to fix this," Evelyn gasped, gripping the edge of my desk with trembling hands. Her knuckles were stark white, and her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "Chloe's family is threatening to completely ruin us. Her father is already calling the district attorney and the state charity commission. The banks are freezing Marcus accounts as we speak. You have to call a major press conference right now. You have to tell the media that the documents you projected last night were a massive mistake. Tell them a disgruntled employee hacked your system. Tell them anything, Maya, just take it back." I sat down slowly in my leather ergonomic chair and folded my hands, resting them on the cool glass surface of my desk. I stared at her, letting the heavy silence stretch until her erratic hyperventilating filled the entire room. "You want me to lie to federal authorities and the public to protect the brother who literally just tried to sue me for my entirely legitimate company?" Evelyn slammed her palms flat against the glass, leaving sweaty handprints. "Yes, you have to take the blame for this, Maya. Look at him. Look at what is happening to your brother. As a black man in this society, Marcus cannot survive this kind of scandal. The corporate world is already out to get him. They will crucify him and lock him away in federal prison forever. But you—" She paused, her voice dropping into a sickeningly persuasive pleading register. "You are a strong black woman, Maya. You have your own massive empire. You have money and influence. You can easily handle the public backlash. You can weather this storm and bounce back. He cannot." The absolute audacity of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was the ultimate toxic expectation, the deeply ingrained societal belief that I existed solely to be the sacrificial mule for the men in my family. I was expected to absorb the trauma, shoulder the criminal blame, and happily destroy my own hard-earned reputation, just so the golden son could avoid the legal consequences of his own actions. My entire life of hard work was just collateral damage to them. "I am not taking the fall for his felonies," I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "He stole your retirement funds to cover his offshore gambling debts and then set up a fake charity to steal from his own community. He is a fraud and a thief. He will finally face the consequences." Evelyn's frantic tears evaporated in a single second. The desperate, pleading mother vanished completely, replaced by a cold, calculating woman backed into a dangerous corner. She straightened her posture, wiped her cheeks, and glared at me with a venomous intensity that perfectly matched Chloe's. "If you do not call that press conference by noon today, I will personally ensure you lose everything," Evelyn threatened, her tone dropping to a sharp, dangerous hiss. "I will officially join Marcus in his lawsuit against your company. I will sit on that witness stand in open court, and I will swear under oath that you ruthlessly manipulated your sick grandfather on his deathbed. I will tell the judge that you forged those transfer documents and stole the family money to build this entire building. I am your mother, Maya. Who do you think the jury will believe? The grieving elderly widow, or the ruthless, greedy businesswoman who just ruined a charity event?" I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her threat. She was entirely willing to commit blatant perjury and destroy my life to shield a criminal. But as I looked into her cold, calculating eyes, a sudden chilling realization washed over me. The confusing puzzle pieces from the mediation abruptly snapped into perfect place. "You knew," I stated softly, the heavy truth settling in my chest. "You did not just find out about the stolen retirement money yesterday at the mediation office. You already knew he drained your accounts." Evelyn scoffed, waving her hand dismissively as if we were discussing a minor grocery bill. "Of course I knew. Marcus came to me months ago crying and begging for help. He made a few bad investments. He needed the rest of the retirement money to set up the consulting firm so he could funnel the gala donations and get back on his feet. We were going to replace the money before your father ever found out. It was a temporary creative solution until you ruined everything with your vindictive little stunt." I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. She was not a victim of Marcus. She was an active, willing co-conspirator. I slowly lifted my left arm and tapped the face of my smartwatch twice. A small green recording icon pulsed brightly on the digital display, contrasting sharply with my dark skin. "Thank you, Mom," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet office. "My legal team just recorded you explicitly admitting to conspiring to commit perjury and actively covering up federal wire fraud." Evelyn's face instantly drained of all color as her eyes locked onto the glowing green light on my wrist. I lowered my arm and calmly instructed my security team to escort my mother out of the building. Evelyn did not scream or fight. The crushing weight of her own recorded confession had completely paralyzed her. I watched her shoulders slump as the reality of her situation finally set in. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, moving like a hollow shell of the woman who had stormed in just minutes earlier. She had tried to leverage my success to save a criminal, and instead she had handed me the exact evidence I needed to permanently sever their control over my life. But cornered rats do not simply surrender. They lash out in unpredictable and dangerous ways. Within 48 hours of Evelyn's humiliating exit, Marcus and Chloe launched their most desperate, unhinged attack yet. If they could not force me to surrender my assets through a fabricated power of attorney or maternal blackmail, they decided to seize them through blatant corporate sabotage. They orchestrated a highly illegal, hostile takeover attempt, targeting the very foundation of my empire. Marcus managed to track down and buy off David, a disgruntled former operations executive I had fired 6 months earlier for gross incompetence and repeated policy violations. David still possessed backdoor access to a legacy server we were in the process of decommissioning. Marcus offered him a lucrative position in his fake consulting firm in exchange for proprietary financial data and a highly confidential list of my top-tier international investors. They were incredibly careless. David used his old corporate email, Alias, to forward internal memos, completely unaware that my IT department flagged and mirrored every single unverified transmission attempting to breach our firewall. I sat at my sleek glass desk reading the intercepted email exchange between David and my brother. Marcus had written a gloating response that perfectly encapsulated his entire toxic worldview. "She has always been too emotional to run a real business," Marcus typed in the intercepted email. "Dad was right, she should have just married well instead of trying to play the boss. Forward me the international investor portfolio immediately. Chloe and I are going to relieve her of this burden." They were planning to weaponize the fabricated trust lawsuit to spook my European investors into abandoning a massive upcoming expansion project. Marcus intended to swoop in mid-panic, offer them a stable alternative through his own firm, and seize control of the development contracts. I decided to let them walk right into the trap. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and clear. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian conference table in our executive boardroom. Flanking me were 4 of my top international investors, led by Henrik, a fiercely intelligent Swedish venture capitalist who had backed my vision from day one. We were reviewing the final details of a global expansion strategy when the heavy boardroom doors swung open without warning. Marcus marched into the room with unearned bravado. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than his remaining bank balance, projecting an aura of completely unmerited authority. Chloe flanked him carrying a designer leather portfolio. She wore a tailored white skirt suit, her chin tilted upward in a mask of pure smug satisfaction. They looked like a couple arriving to collect an award rather than two criminals stepping onto a corporate landmine. Marcus slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the polished obsidian table. He turned directly to Henrik and the other investors, completely ignoring my presence at the head of the table. "Gentlemen, I am Marcus Wilson," he announced, puffing out his chest. "I am here to issue a formal warning regarding your capital. My sister's company is currently entangled in a massive federal lawsuit regarding stolen trust funds and corporate fraud. Her assets are about to be entirely frozen by the authorities. If you proceed with this expansion, you will lose every single cent of your investment." Before Henrik could even respond to the ridiculous intrusion, Chloe leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table. She offered the investors a sickeningly sweet, highly rehearsed smile. "We know Maya can be a bit aggressive and difficult to work with," Chloe said, her tone dripping with casual racism and deliberate microaggressions. "She simply lacks the proper temperament for high-level international business. But do not worry, gentlemen. To protect your capital, I am perfectly willing to step in as an interim manager to smooth things over with the white investors." Silence fell over the boardroom. It was not a stunned silence or a fearful silence. It was a heavy, judging silence. The investors exchanged impassive glances, completely unbothered by the dramatic performance unfolding in front of them. I sat silently, steepling my fingers and watching my brother dig his own grave. Henrik slowly removed his reading glasses, folding them meticulously and placing them on the table. He looked at Chloe, scanning her designer outfit with mild amusement, before turning his attention entirely back to Marcus. Henrik let out a sharp, genuine laugh that cut through the tension in the room like a physical blow. "Mr. Marcus," Henrik said, his voice thick with a Swedish accent and absolute unwavering authority, "you seem to labor under a severe delusion about who holds the power in this room. Maya did not pitch us this company. We sought her out. She is one of the most brilliant minds in commercial real estate globally. We do not invest in empty corporate shells. We invest exclusively in her." Marcus faltered, his arrogant smile slipping slightly as he looked between the unbothered investors and my completely calm expression. He opened his mouth to argue, but Henrik raised a hand to silence him. "Furthermore, you have deeply misunderstood the nature of our business here today." Henrik continued, his tone dropping to a predatory level. "We are not just expanding Apex real estate development. We sought to diversify our holdings. We just finalized the acquisition of Vanguard Financial." The color instantly drained from Marcus' face. Vanguard Financial was his primary commercial lender, the institution holding the massive mortgages on his failing properties, and the very bank he owed for his disastrous offshore gambling debts. "Which means, as of 9 o'clock this morning," Henrik concluded, pointing his gold pen directly at my brother, "Maya's company owns all of your outstanding debt. You are officially bankrupt." Marcus collapsed into the nearest leather chair, as if all the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. He stared blankly at the polished obsidian table, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Chloe stumbled backward, her pristine white skirt suit suddenly looking like a ridiculous costume. She clutched her designer portfolio against her chest, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. "Get out of my boardroom," I commanded, keeping my voice completely level. "Security is waiting in the hallway. If you ever attempt to breach this building or contact my investors again, I will not just freeze your remaining assets. I will personally oversee their liquidation." They did not argue. They did not attempt another pathetic display of arrogance. Marcus shuffled out of the room, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man, while Chloe trailed behind him, her head bowed in absolute defeat. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them, sealing their financial ruin. Henrik simply adjusted his cuffs, picked up his gold pen, and seamlessly redirected the conversation back to our European expansion timeline, as if a minor pest had just been swatted away. My phone rang exactly 24 hours later. The caller ID displayed the main line for the Oakmont Country Club. It was the exclusive ultra-conservative establishment where my father spent his afternoons drinking expensive scotch and trading favors with the old guard of the city's elite. I answered the call and was immediately greeted by Richard's booming, furious voice demanding my presence. He did not ask. He issued a summons. I was instructed to meet him in the private cigar lounge at 4 o'clock sharp. I arrived at the club wearing a tailored charcoal pantsuit that radiated absolute executive control. The Oakmont was a relic of a bygone era, smelling faintly of stale tobacco, polished brass, and unearned patriarchal privilege. As I walked through the dimly lit hallways, I felt the familiar weight of the atmosphere. This was a place where women were traditionally expected to smile, pour drinks, and remain completely silent while the men conducted real business. I strode past the judgmental glares of elderly members and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the private lounge. Richard was seated in his usual corner booth, a half-empty glass of scotch resting on the table in front of him. His face was a thunderous shade of purple, and the veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He did not stand to greet me. He simply pointed a trembling finger at the empty leather chair opposite him. "You have completely lost your mind, Maya," my father growled, his voice vibrating with a deep, terrifying anger that used to make me cower as a child. "I just got off the phone with Vanguard Financial. They confirmed that your company bought out Marcus' debt. You are deliberately destroying your own brother's life. You are destroying my namesake and dragging the Wilson family reputation through the mud." I sat down, slowly crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. Marcus destroyed his own life, Dad. He committed federal wire fraud and attempted a hostile takeover of my company. I simply removed his ability to cause further damage. Richard slammed his heavy fist onto the table, making his scotch glass rattle violently against the wood. "You ungrateful, vicious little girl," he barked, echoing decades of making me feel like an absolute burden simply for existing. "I put a roof over your head. I fed you. I clothed you. Everything you have, every single ounce of success you claim to possess, is because of the name I gave you. You owe this family your loyalty. You are supposed to protect your brother, not humiliate him in front of the entire city." I stared at the man who had systematically ignored my achievements while aggressively funding my brother's failures. The absolute delusion was staggering. He truly believed my corporate empire was simply a byproduct of his mediocre legacy. "You gave me a name," I replied, my voice icy and calm. "I built the empire." Marcus was handed everything on a silver platter and he burned it all to the ground. My father leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into dark, menacing slits. He was preparing to deploy the ultimate patriarchal intimidation tactic. He was going to remind me of his power. "You think because you wear a nice suit and bought up a few debts that you are untouchable," he hissed, leaning closer across the table. "I built this city, Maya. I know the mayor. I know the zoning commissioners. I know every single developer who controls the commercial real estate board. If you do not immediately release Marcus from that debt and publicly issue an apology, I will make a few phone calls. I will have you permanently blacklisted from every major development contract in this state. I will crush you, Maya. You will have absolutely nothing." He sat back, taking a slow, confident sip of his scotch. He was entirely convinced he had just delivered a fatal blow. He expected me to panic, to apologize, and to fall back into my designated role as the subservient daughter. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase. I bypassed the sleek corporate tablets and digital files. My fingers closed around a thick physical document. I pulled out a dusty, yellowed manila folder. The edges were frayed and the paper was brittle with age. I dropped it onto the table directly in front of him. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet lounge. Richard looked down at the faded folder. His confident sneer wavered slightly. "What is this garbage?" I leaned forward, mirroring his aggressive posture but maintaining absolute terrifying control. "Crush me?" I asked, softly tilting my head. "Dad, the only reason you did not go to federal prison in 2012 for corporate embezzlement is because I took the $50,000 I had saved from working 3 jobs for my master's degree, and I secretly paid off your internal auditors." The color instantly drained from my father's face. The blood rushed from his cheeks, leaving him looking gray and suddenly incredibly old. His eyes locked onto the yellowed folder as if it were a live explosive. "You told Mom it was a minor accounting error." I continued, my voice cutting through the thick silence of the room. "But I saw the ledgers. I saw the phantom accounts you used to hide the money you lost on those disastrous real estate bets. You were facing 20 years in federal lockup. I sacrificed my own education, my own future to keep you out of a jumpsuit. I opened the folder revealing the meticulously preserved bank transfer receipts and signed non-disclosure agreements from the auditing firm. I have every single receipt, Dad, every wire transfer, every signature. Richard opened his mouth, but his voice completely failed him. His hands trembled as he stared at the physical proof of his own criminal mediocrity. The great patriarch, the powerful businessman who built the city, was staring at the exact moment his daughter had to buy his freedom. "You did not make me," I stated, standing up from the leather booth and looking down at the broken man in front of me. "I saved you. I gave up my dreams so you could keep playing the successful patriarch. And you repaid me by handing every advantage to a son who nearly bankrupted you. I am never saving you again." I turned my back on my father and walked out of the cigar lounge, leaving him completely paralyzed by the weight of his own buried sins. I stepped out of the heavy mahogany doors of the private cigar lounge, leaving the oppressive scent of aged scotch and stale tobacco firmly behind me. The thick silence I left in my wake was more satisfying than any screaming match could have ever been. I walked down the long carpeted corridor of the Oakmont Country Club, my heels sinking slightly into the overly plush runner. The walls were lined with oil paintings of past club presidents, all stern-faced white men who had built their wealth on the backs of uncredited labor. For decades, this building had been a monument to my father's untouchable status. Now it was just another piece of real estate I could easily acquire and demolish if I so chose. I needed a moment to center myself before facing the bright afternoon sun. I pushed open the frosted glass door of the ladies' powder room. The space was an excessive display of country club wealth, featuring imported rose-colored marble countertops, crystal chandeliers, and gold-plated fixtures. I walked over to the nearest sink, turned the faceted brass handle, and let the scalding hot water run over my hands. I was washing away the metaphorical dirt of my father's pathetic ultimatum when a sharp, definitive click echoed through the empty room. I looked up into the massive gilded mirror. Chloe was standing directly behind me, having just thrown the heavy brass deadbolt to lock us inside. She looked entirely unhinged. The perfectly curated society wife who had tried to publicly humiliate me just hours ago was completely gone. Her designer silk blouse was wrinkled, her posture was frantic, and the heavy foundation she used to mask her insecurities was visibly sweating off her face. The sinking ship of my brother's empire was dragging her down into the abyss, and she was desperately clawing for a life raft. Chloe dropped the sweet, supportive sister-in-law act with whiplash-inducing speed. She closed the distance between us, her movements jerky and erratic. The scent of her cloying, expensive perfume filled the space, mixing with the sharp tang of her genuine fear. "Look, Maya," she began, her voice entirely devoid of its usual high-pitched, affected charm. "You people always hold grudges. I will make you a deal. Give me $2 million to quietly divorce Marcus and disappear, and I will give you the hard drive with all his illegal offshore accounts." I kept my gaze locked on hers through the reflection in the mirror. I did not immediately reach for a towel. I let the hot water continue to run, forcing her to stand there in the agonizing silence. The sheer transactional nature of her existence was fascinating to witness in real time. The moment the charity fraud went public, her own affluent family had clearly cut her off, disgusted by the public relations nightmare. She had no loyalty to Marcus. She had married a balance sheet, and now that the accounts were seized, she was trying to liquidate the remaining assets. $2 million! I repeated softly, my voice echoing against the cold marble walls. "You want a multi-million-dollar severance package to abandon the husband you proudly helped commit federal wire fraud. I am offering you the final nail in his coffin." "Maya," she pressed, stepping even closer until I could see the frantic pulse beating in her neck. "My family is threatening to disown me if my name ends up on a federal indictment. I know exactly where Marcus hid the rest of your parents' retirement money. I know the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. I downloaded everything onto a physical drive before the bank froze the domestic accounts. $2 million is spare change to you now. Pay me, and you can hand him over to the authorities tied up with a neat little bow." I finally turned off the water. I reached to my right, pulled a thick monogrammed linen towel from the brass basket, and began meticulously drying my hands. I did not offer her a response. I simply looked at her with a cold, detached clinical observation. I was looking at a parasite trying to negotiate terms with the host it had just failed to bleed dry. My absolute silence pushed Chloe over the edge. The desperate negotiator vanished, replaced by the deeply ingrained entitlement and blatant racism that fueled her entire family tree. Her face twisted into an ugly, vicious snarl. "You think you are so smart in your little suits, but without my family's connections, Marcus would have never even looked at you." She spat, the venom practically dripping from her teeth. "You are nothing but a diversity quota who got lucky. You think you can just destroy my life and walk away untouched. I am a Caldwell. We do not go down for people like you. Pay me or I swear I will tell the feds you masterminded the charity fraud. I will tell them Marcus was just acting on your direct corporate orders. I will drag you into that courtroom, and I will make sure the jury sees you as the angry, vindictive architect of this entire scheme." She was breathing heavily now, her chest heaving with the exertion of her own toxic hatred. She truly believed her whiteness and her maiden name were an impenetrable shield. She thought the threat of federal perjury would make me cower, just like my father had attempted only minutes before. They all relied on the exact same tired, predictable playbook. I finished drying my hands. I folded the damp linen towel into a perfect square and placed it gently on the edge of the marble counter. I turned to fully face her, my expression dangerously calm. "You should really check for renovations, Chloe." "Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational volume. Her brow furrowed in sudden, profound confusion. "What are you talking about?" I raised my hand and pointed a single manicured finger directly at the massive gilded mirror spanning the wall behind the sinks. I tapped the glass right where a tiny, almost imperceptible black sensor was embedded into the frame. This club upgraded to smart mirrors with integrated security audio. Last week I explained watching the color drain from her face in real time. They implemented the system to monitor the staff and prevent theft in the locker rooms. The feed goes directly to the main security office. The club president, who happens to sit on my corporate board of directors, just heard you attempt federal extortion. He just heard you admit to possessing evidence of offshore money laundering. And he just heard you threaten to commit perjury against a sitting board member. Chloe stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the slick marble floor. She stared at the tiny embedded sensor in the mirror as if it were the barrel of a loaded gun. I stepped smoothly past her, unbothered by her sudden paralyzed state. I reached for the brass deadbolt, unlocking the heavy door with a loud, echoing crack. "You do not need $2 million for a divorce, Chloe," I said, looking over my shoulder as I pulled the door open. "You need it for a very good defense attorney, and I highly suggest you run." I watched her reflection shrink as I walked down the plush carpeted hallway of the Oakmont. Chloe did not follow me. The profound silence she left behind was the sound of a parasite realizing the host had just become the predator. By the time I reached my car, my legal team had already secured a copy of the audio file from the club president. The trap was set, but Marcus and Chloe were still frantically swimming in an ocean of denial. Exactly 3 days later, my brother decided the best way to handle impending federal indictments and total financial ruin was to throw a massive party. He and Chloe were hosting a lavish 10th anniversary celebration at their sprawling gated mansion in the wealthy northern suburbs. It was a desperate, calculated maneuver designed to project an image of untouchable success to their remaining peers. If they threw enough champagne and caviar at the city's elite, maybe everyone would forget the charity scandal and the glaring fact that Vanguard Financial had just been acquired. I drove my sleek black sedan up the winding tree-lined avenue toward his estate. The sheer scale of the event was staggering. Valets in crisp white uniforms were sprinting back and forth, parking a fleet of imported luxury vehicles. A string quartet played softly near the entrance, and the glow of hundreds of string lights illuminated the manicured lawns. I pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates. The security guard, a burly man hired specifically for the evening, stepped out of his booth and held up a flat palm. He leaned down to my window, a laminated guest list clipped to a glowing tablet in his hand. "I am sorry, Mom," he said, his tone entirely professional but firm. Mr. Wilson gave explicit instructions. You are not on the approved guest list. I am going to have to ask you to turn your vehicle around. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or demand entry. I simply smiled politely, put the car in park, and pulled out my phone. I dialed a single local number I had saved earlier that morning. Yes, I am at the main gate, I said, keeping my eyes locked on the confused security guard. We are ready to proceed. While I waited outside the gates, I could hear the sharp clinking of a knife against crystal echoing through the estate's massive outdoor sound system. Marcus was making his grand address. I stepped out of my car and walked casually toward the wrought iron bars, giving me a clear, unobstructed view of the sweeping marble balcony overlooking the pool. Marcus stood there in a custom white tuxedo jacket, raising a flute of vintage champagne. Chloe stood beside him wearing a forced frozen smile. Below them, a sea of affluent guests held their breath, completely oblivious to the reality crashing down around them. They say the higher you climb, the harder the wind blows. Marcus projected, his voice booming through the speakers. This past week has been a test of our resolve. There are always going to be haters in this world. There will always be jealous family members who cannot stand to see a successful black man rise above his station and claim his rightful throne. They want to see us fall. They want to tear down the empire Chloe and I built with our bare hands. But we are untouchable. We are stronger than the petty, vindictive people who try to drag our name through the mud. The crowd erupted into polite applause. Marcus beamed, soaking up the fraudulent adoration. Then the sirens started. The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens cut through the classical music and the polite clapping. The heavy wrought iron gate slowly swung open, not for me, but for the 3 county sheriff vehicles that suddenly swerved into the driveway. Their red and blue emergency lights flashed brilliantly against the manicured hedges and the expensive gowns of the horrified guests. The valets scattered as the heavy cruisers parked directly on the pristine circular driveway, blocking the entrance entirely. 4 uniformed deputies stepped out, hands resting casually on their utility belts. The head sheriff, a tall, imposing man with a grim expression, walked straight past the bewildered guests and marched directly up the sweeping marble staircase toward the balcony. The music abruptly died. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, murmuring in shock and confusion. Marcus lowered his champagne flute, the arrogant smile sliding right off his face. Chloe grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his white tuxedo jacket. Marcus Wilson, the head sheriff, announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the silent crowd without the need for a microphone. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents attached to a heavy metal clipboard from under his arm. He stepped onto the balcony and thrust the clipboard directly into my brother's chest. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "This is private property. We are hosting a private event." "Not anymore," the sheriff replied, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "Marcus and Chloe Wilson, this property was legally foreclosed upon 48 hours ago. Vanguard Financial transferred the deed this morning." The collective gasp from the affluent crowd was deafening. The guests immediately began stepping backward, putting physical distance between themselves and the social pariahs on the balcony. "There is a mistake," Marcus stammered, frantically flipping through the legal documents. "You cannot do this. I have rights. The paperwork is perfectly in order," Mr. Wilson, the sheriff, stated loudly, ensuring every single person in the courtyard heard him clearly. "The new owner, Ms. Maya Wilson, has requested your immediate eviction from her property. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises before my deputies begin physically removing your belongings." The sheer absolute silence that followed the head sheriff's announcement was heavier than concrete. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The caterers froze with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres suspended in midair. The string quartet sat paralyzed with their bows resting against silent cellos. Then the reality of the situation broke the spell, and absolute chaos erupted. The wealthy elite of the city, the investors and socialites who had just been toasting to Marcus and Chloe's untouchable success, immediately began scrambling for the exits. They whispered frantically to one another, hiking up their designer gowns and abandoning half-empty crystal champagne flutes on the manicured lawn. They were treating Marcus and Chloe like they had a highly contagious disease. Social annihilation was unfolding in real time. Evelyn stood frozen near the edge of the sprawling marble patio. I watched her eyes dart wildly, taking in the flashing red and blue lights of the sheriff cruisers, blocking the driveway, and the mass exodus of her most vital country club peers. The carefully curated illusion of the perfect wealthy family was completely shattered. She realized in that exact moment that no amount of smooth talking or aggressive posturing was going to stop the armed deputies from locking the heavy iron doors of the mansion. She was cornered. She needed to stop the clock. She needed an immediate, highly visible distraction. I saw the precise, calculated shift in her expression before she made her move. Evelyn abruptly clutched the bodice of her silk evening gown, her face twisting into a mask of sudden, excruciating agony. She let out a loud, theatrical gasp that echoed sharply over the panicked murmurs of the fleeing crowd. Her knees buckled with perfectly practiced dramatic timing, ensuring she missed the sharp edge of a stone planter before she collapsed completely onto the cold marble patio. She lay there motionless, one hand draped tragically over her chest. Richard dropped to his knees beside her, his face draining of all color. He shouted for someone to call an ambulance, his voice cracking with genuine panic. He grabbed Evelyn's limp hand, chafing it between his own before his head snapped up. His eyes locked onto me as I stood calmly near the wrought iron gates, observing the performance with clinical detachment. The sheer absolute fury in his gaze was toxic. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his features contorted with rage. "Look what you have done!" Richard screamed, his voice echoing violently against the stone facade of the mansion. "You are killing your own mother over money. You have always been a heartless, cold girl." His vicious words hung in the humid night air, but I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. His furious accusation was merely the desperate echo of a patriarchal script he had used against me for decades. He was loudly reinforcing the same toxic narrative that had defined my entire childhood. In his eyes, my independence, my refusal to be financially bled dry to support his golden son, and my demand for basic accountability were unforgivable sins. He had always made me feel like an absolute burden, simply for existing and having the audacity to succeed on my own terms. To him, my lack of blind subservience was proof that I was cold and unnatural. But his words no longer held any power over me. I simply stood my ground, watching the pathetic scene unfold. Within minutes, the distant wail of an approaching ambulance grew louder, piercing the night air. Paramedics rushed through the open gates, rolling a stretcher over the damp grass. Chloe immediately went into full dramatic daughter-in-law mode, dropping to her knees next to Richard and sobbing loudly enough for the remaining stragglers to witness her profound grief. She clutched her face, wailing about the stress of the evening. It was a masterclass in deflection. The paramedics quickly loaded Evelyn onto the stretcher, securing the straps as Richard hovered anxiously over them. He climbed into the back of the ambulance, holding his wife's hand, as the heavy doors slammed shut. The vehicle sped off down the winding avenue, its sirens blaring into the distance. While the crowd was entirely captivated by the medical emergency, my focus shifted. I scanned the chaotic patio and noticed a glaring absence. Marcus was gone. While his mother was supposedly fighting for her life on the marble pavement, Marcus had not rushed to her side. He had not shed a single tear or offered a word of comfort. I quickly calculated his trajectory. The master suite was locked down, but his private ground floor office was easily accessible from the side garden. I flagged down the head sheriff, who was busy directing his deputies to secure the perimeter of the estate. I gestured toward the dark side path of the mansion. "We need to check the home office immediately," I told him, my voice low and urgent. "The eviction notice was effective 48 hours ago, which means every piece of corporate property inside that house is legally mine. He is trying to destroy evidence." The sheriff nodded sharply, signaling for two of his armed deputies to follow us. We moved swiftly and silently through the manicured side garden, bypassing the abandoned party decorations. We approached the heavy glass French doors, leading directly into Marcus' private study. Even through the thick insulated glass, the aggressive mechanical whirring sound of a heavy-duty industrial shredder cut clearly through the silence of the empty house. The sheriff pushed the unlocked door open, and we stepped into the dimly lit office. The room smelled of stale scotch and panic. Marcus was standing behind his massive oak desk, sweating profusely in his custom white tuxedo. He was frantically shoving thick stacks of sensitive banking documents into the shredder, the machine grinding loudly as it destroyed the paper. At the exact same time, his left hand was rapidly clicking a wireless mouse. He was desperately dragging highly incriminating digital ledgers from his desktop into a permanent secure wipe software program. He was trying to erase the entire financial footprint of his fake charity. The bright glow of his monitor clearly displayed the exact titles of the classified corporate documents he was attempting to obliterate forever. The screen showed Duyan Mao 3116, DocX alongside Duyan Mao 4116, DocX, and directly below those were Duyan Mao 2116, DocX, and Duyan Mao 1116, DocX. How was actively destroying the very blueprints of his offshore fraud. Step away from the desk and the machine immediately. Mr. Wilson, the head sheriff, commanded, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. You are actively destroying property that no longer belongs to you. Marcus jumped violently, dropping a stack of papers onto the floor. His eyes darted between the armed deputies and my impassive face. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, his breathing heavy and ragged. I am just clearing out some old personal junk before the eviction, he stammered, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of fear and manufactured outrage. My mother is dying in a hospital right now. Have some basic human respect. You are harassing a grieving son. I stepped forward slowly, circling the edge of the oak desk, until I was standing mere inches from him. I looked down at the spinning shredder and the glowing computer monitor before locking my eyes directly onto his terrified face. Nice try with the diversion, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling finality. But the attending ER doctor is my college roommate. She just pulled Mom's chart. Mom's vitals are perfect, but the doctor did find an email on Mom's phone from you literally outlining the heart attack plan to delay the eviction. I turned my back on his stunned, pathetic expression and walked out of the hospital corridor, leaving Marcus standing there completely paralyzed by the revelation of his own botched scheme. Was immensely satisfying. The heavy swinging doors of the intensive care ward clicked shut behind me, severing the final tie I had to his manufactured family drama. I bypassed the main elevators and headed directly for the concrete stairwell leading down into the subterranean parking garage. The air instantly shifted from sterile hospital antiseptic to the damp, heavy scent of exhaust and cold cement. I could hear him coming before the heavy steel door even banged open against the cinder block wall. Marcus was not going to let me walk away. His entire identity was predicated on having the last word, on dominating the narrative. His rapid, heavy footsteps echoed violently down the stairwell, bouncing off the concrete walls like erratic gunshots. He was taking the steps two at a time, descending into the dim yellow light of the parking garage with a reckless, manic energy. I reached my sleek black sedan parked in a designated VIP bay near the exit. My hand was inches from the door handle when Marcus violently lunged out of the shadows. He slammed his body weight against the driver's side door, effectively trapping me between the thick concrete pillar and the cold metal of my car. The image of the untouchable corporate titan was completely gone. His custom white tuxedo jacket was rumpled and soaked with sweat at the collar. His silk bow tie hung limply around his neck like a broken noose. His chest heaved and his eyes were wide, frantic, and bloodshot. He looked exactly like a cornered animal realizing the trap had already snapped shut and there was nowhere left to run. You think you are better than me? He sneered, his voice echoing sharply across the empty parking level. Saliva flew from his lips as he leaned closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. The stench of stale alcohol and sheer panic radiated off him in waves. I am the son. Maya, he barked, his face twisting into an ugly grimace. I am the one carrying the legacy. I am the one Dad chose to build this empire. You think buying up my debt and serving an eviction notice makes you a winner. You think it makes you powerful. It just proves exactly what this family has always known about you. He leaned in closer, his breathing ragged and uneven. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who buys buildings because she cannot buy a husband. You throw your money around to punish people who actually have love and respect in their lives. You have your corporate accounts and your tailored suits, but you are nothing. You are completely empty. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at him, analyzing the profound depths of his delusion. He was relying on the oldest, most pathetic patriarchal insult in the book. He truly believed that a woman's worth was defined by her marital status, while he stood there an indicted fraudster whose own wife had just attempted to sell him out for $2 million in a country club bathroom. He was projecting a lifetime of his own profound inadequacies directly onto me. My absolute silence enraged him further. Denied the emotional reaction he so desperately craved, Marcus completely lost whatever fragile grip he had left on his sanity. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He raised his right hand, crossing the invisible boundary from verbal abuse into direct physical intimidation. I did not blink as his fist came down. I knew he was too much of a coward to actually strike me. Instead, he bypassed my face by mere inches and slammed his knuckles directly into the driver's side window of my sedan. The impact sounded like a gunshot in the enclosed concrete cavern. The reinforced safety glass spider-webbed instantly before buckling inward and shattering completely. Thousands of glittering shards rained down onto the asphalt and into the pristine leather interior of my car. The violent crash echoed off the low ceiling, ringing in my ears. Marcus stood there, panting heavily. Blood trickled down his scraped knuckles, dripping slowly onto the white cuff of his expensive shirt. He leaned his face into the ruined window frame, his eyes burning with a dark, unhinged malice. He genuinely thought he had finally established dominance. He thought he had successfully terrified me into submission. "I will ruin you," he spat, the threat laced with an absolute promise of violence. "I will tear down everything you built piece by piece until you have absolutely nothing left." I remained completely motionless. My heart rate had not elevated a single beat. I reached calmly into the pocket of my charcoal trousers. My fingers closed around my remote key fob. I did not press the standard unlock button. I pressed the auxiliary security switch I had specifically installed for moments exactly like this. Instantly, the high-intensity overhead security floodlights wired directly to my reserved parking bay blazed to life. The brilliant white light banished the shadows, completely illuminating every corner of our section with a blinding clinical glare. Marcus flinched, throwing his uninjured hand up to shield his eyes from the sudden intense brightness. Measured, calm, professional footsteps approached from the far side of the concrete pillar. A man stepped smoothly into the floodlights. He was dressed in a nondescript dark gray suit, holding a thick leather-bound folio and a digital recorder. His expression was the picture of lethal federal authority. The gold badge clipped to his belt caught the harsh overhead light. "Marcus," I said, my voice smooth, level, and slicing through his manufactured bravado like a scalpel. "Meet Agent Harris from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. He was just taking my official statement regarding your offshore accounts and the Vanguard financial wire transfers." I tilted my head, looking pointedly at his bleeding knuckles and the shattered glass covering my leather seats. "But I think he would love to add assaulting a federal witness to your charges." Agent Harris pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound echoed off the concrete walls of the parking garage as he forcefully spun Marcus around and secured him against the hood of my ruined sedan. Marcus did not fight back. He did not yell or throw another punch. The sheer, undeniable reality of a federal agent reading him his Miranda rights completely extinguished the violent, unhinged rage he had displayed only seconds prior. He was instantly reduced to a trembling, sobbing mess of a man. His knees buckled and he slid down the side of the car, weeping into the shattered glass scattered across the pavement. I did not stay to watch him cry. I did not offer a final word of sibling comfort. I simply stepped over the sparkling shards of glass, called my private security detail to retrieve me, and left my brother in the cold grip of the federal justice system. Less than 12 hours later, my private office line rang. The caller ID proudly displayed the flagship number for Caldwell Enterprises. Arthur Caldwell did not call to request a meeting. He did not ask for a moment of my time. He dictated a time and a place with the absolute assumed authority of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He demanded my presence at his downtown penthouse at exactly noon. I accepted the invitation with a polite, icy smile that he could not see through the receiver. I already knew exactly what he was going to try and do. I arrived at the Caldwell penthouse precisely on time. The private elevator doors slid silently open, revealing a sprawling multi-level residence that reeked of generational wealth and unearned superiority. The floors were imported white marble. The walls were lined with original contemporary art. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the city skyline. It was an impeccably designed fortress built to keep the consequences of the real world firmly locked outside. Arthur Caldwell stood at the head of a massive glass dining table, his posture rigid and authoritative. His wife stood silently behind him, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water like a prop. Chloe was slouched on a white leather sofa nearby, looking exhausted, but still deeply dangerously arrogant. Marcus was noticeably absent, presumably still sitting in a federal holding cell, waiting for a bail hearing that was never going to come. Arthur did not offer to shake my hand. He did not offer me a seat. He simply stared at me with undisguised contempt before reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored suit. He pulled out a heavy leather-bound checkbook and tossed it carelessly onto the glass table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack. "Name your price, Maya," he commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "We know exactly what this is about. We know your kind. You felt slighted by my daughter and you want a payday. So let us cut the theatrics and get straight to the transaction. Take the money, drop the eviction proceedings against the estate, and retract your statements to the FBI." I looked down at the leather checkbook and then back up at Arthur. The sheer blinding audacity of the man was almost impressive. He genuinely believed that his bank account was a magical eraser that could wipe away federal wire fraud and international money laundering. He thought I was just a bitter, disgruntled relative looking for a quick cash grab. Chloe stood up from the leather sofa, her confidence entirely restored by the presence of her powerful father. She walked over to the table and crossed her arms, smirking at me with that familiar toxic entitlement. She felt completely safe inside her father's penthouse. She truly believed her white privilege and her maiden name were an impenetrable shield against the law. "Just take it, Maya," she sneered, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "We all know you are just doing this because you are jealous. You could never fit into our world, so you tried to tear it down. My father is being incredibly generous. Write down a number and walk away. You will never see this kind of money otherwise." I stood there in the center of their pristine white penthouse and let the silence stretch out. I let them bask in their false sense of victory for 10 long, agonizing seconds. I wanted them to remember this exact moment of supreme overconfidence. I slowly reached out and placed a single manicured finger on the leather checkbook. I did not open it. I simply slid it across the smooth glass table, pushing it right back until it bumped against Arthur's hand. "I do not need your money, Arthur," I said, my voice perfectly level and terrifyingly calm. "Especially since the SEC froze every single one of your domestic and international accounts at 8 o'clock this morning." Arthur's confident sneer vanished instantly. His brow furrowed in sudden confusion. "What are you talking about?" I kept my eyes locked on his, watching the realization begin to dawn. "I handed over the digital ledgers Marcus tried to shred last night," I explained, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "Did you really think Marcus was smart enough to engineer a massive charity fraud all by himself? He was just the eager, desperate pawn." I tracked the digital footprint. Turns out the money from the charity fraud was not just funding Marcus and Chloe's lifestyle. It was being systematically funneled through shell companies directly into your offshore accounts in Cyprus. You were using my brother's pathetic desperation to cover your own failing corporate investments." Chloe's smirk completely dissolved. She looked at her father, her eyes widening in sudden, absolute panic. "Dad, what is she talking about?" Arthur snatched his cell phone from the table, his fingers suddenly trembling. Before he could even unlock the screen, the device began ringing frantically. The caller ID flashed the name of his chief legal counsel. He answered it, pressing the phone to his ear. I watched the last remaining drops of color drain from his face as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. His jaw slacked. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered loudly against the marble floor. "They are at the building," he whispered, staring blankly at the wall. "That is right, Arthur," I said, turning my gaze back to Chloe. "The feds are raiding your corporate offices right now. They are seizing the servers, the physical ledgers, and every piece of hardware in the building." You thought you could use my family to line your pockets and hide behind your generational wealth. You thought your name made you untouchable. Chloe let out a strangled, gasping sound. Her legs simply gave out beneath her. She dropped heavily to her knees on the cold white marble, the undeniable horror of her absolute ruin finally crashing down around her. Chloe remained kneeling on the cold white marble of her parents' penthouse, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her face as the reality of her absolute ruin crashed down around her. Her father Arthur was still staring blankly at his dropped cell phone, his generational wealth evaporating into federal seizures. The impenetrable shield of their elite status was gone. In that singular moment of pure terror, Chloe made a brutally calculated decision. Her loyalty to her family and to her husband was entirely transactional. With the ship rapidly sinking, she was going to secure the only available lifeboat. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring her parents' paralyzed shock, and bolted for the private elevator. She had one desperate card left to play. Less than an hour later, my private receptionist buzzed my office line. She informed me that Chloe Caldwell was standing in the lobby demanding to see me immediately. She was frantic, weeping, and completely refusing to leave the premises. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, steepling my fingers and staring out at the sweeping city views from my corner window. I instructed my receptionist to let her in. The heavy mahogany doors to my office swung open. Chloe stumbled inside looking completely unrecognizable from the arrogant socialite who had just mocked me in her father's penthouse. Her designer mascara was heavily smeared beneath her eyes. Her hair was disheveled and she was visibly trembling. The manufactured tears were flowing freely. She practically threw herself into one of the guest chairs across from my expansive glass desk. She did not waste a single second attempting to defend her parents or her husband. She went straight into survival mode. "Maya, you have to listen to me," she begged, her voice cracking with perfectly rehearsed hysteria. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this. Marcus is completely out of control. He hid everything from me. I am just as much of a victim here as anyone else." I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, keeping my hands folded calmly on the desk. "You were listed as a managing director on the fake charity board, Chloe," I stated flatly. "The federal investigators are going to trace the offshore transfers directly back to your accounts." She shook her head violently, gripping the edge of my desk. "No, you do not understand. I was manipulated. He is a charismatic, aggressive man. Maya, you know how he is. The jury will believe me a scared wife. Just give me immunity from your civil suit. I can give you everything. I can tell you every single detail of his operation. I can hand you Marcus on a silver platter." I watched her perform this masterful betrayal with clinical detachment. She was willing to feed her own husband to the federal authorities without a single moment of hesitation, just to save her own skin. She was banking on her ability to play the fragile, manipulated woman. She thought I would be so eager to destroy my brother that I would blindly accept her offering. It was a fascinating display of narcissistic survival. I let out a soft, sympathetic sigh, deliberately softening my posture. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk, and looked at her with manufactured understanding. "I have always known how aggressive Marcus can be, Chloe," I said, keeping my tone gentle and encouraging. "He has bullied people his entire life. It must have been absolutely terrifying to be trapped in a marriage with a man operating a criminal enterprise right under your nose." Chloe seized the lifeline instantly. She nodded frantically, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "It was a nightmare, Maya. He forced me to sign documents I did not understand. He yelled at me whenever I asked questions about the charity funds. I was just trying to be a supportive wife. I was so scared of what he might do if I pushed back." I pulled a thick yellow legal pad and a silver fountain pen from my drawer and pushed them across the glass desk toward her. "If you want me to grant you immunity from the civil litigation, I need you to document everything," I told her, my voice taking on a collaborative, protective tone. "I need a full, detailed written account of exactly how Marcus manipulated the funds. I need account names, transfer dates, and the specific mechanisms he used to funnel the charity money offshore. If you write it all down right now, I can use it to build an airtight case against him and ensure you are protected as a cooperating witness." Chloe did not hesitate. The relief flooding her face was palpable. She grabbed the silver pen and began writing furiously. The scratch of the nib against the paper filled the quiet office. She was literally documenting a massive financial fraud in real time, entirely convinced she was securing her own salvation. For nearly 45 minutes, she poured every illicit detail onto the legal pad. She listed the exact routing numbers for the offshore accounts in Cyprus. She detailed the false invoices Marcus generated to drain the charity funds. She explicitly outlined how the money moved from the non-profit sector into their private holding accounts. She laid out the entire anatomy of their criminal enterprise under the guise of an innocent wife recounting her husband's tyranny. When she finally finished, she slid the legal pad back across the desk. She had filled 4 pages with highly incriminating financial intelligence. At the very bottom, she had signed her full name, sealing the document as a formal legal statement. There she breathed, wiping a smudge of mascara from her cheek. That is everything. Every single illegal thing he did. Now you have to honor our deal, Maya. You have to give me immunity. I picked up the legal pad and slowly reviewed her handwriting. It was a beautiful, comprehensive roadmap of high-level corporate fraud. I looked back up at Chloe, allowing the sympathetic mask to completely drop from my face. My expression shifted into one of cold, absolute finality. This is a great confession, Chloe, I said smoothly, tapping the silver pen against the desk. But you forgot one detail. Her confident relief faltered slightly. Her eyes darted nervously. What detail? I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto her suddenly terrified face. You are the sole signatory on all the Delaware shell companies, I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal register. Every single offshore transfer you just documented required your personal authorization token. Marcus did not manipulate you, he was your fall guy. And you just gave me the final piece of evidence I needed to prove you were orchestrating the entire laundering operation. The air seemed to completely vanish from the room. Chloe stared at me, her jaw slack, her breathing shallow and rapid. The realization of what she had just done hit her with the force of a freight train. She had just handed and signed a full confession to federal wire fraud under the delusion that it would save her. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You said you would protect me. I never promised you anything, I replied flatly. I simply agreed to take your statement. I reached out and pressed the intercom button on my console. Send them in, I instructed. The heavy mahogany doors to my office immediately opened. My lead corporate attorney, flanked by 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers, walked into the room. They moved with swift professional precision. Ms. Caldwell, one of the agents said, stepping directly toward her chair. We need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back. Chloe remained frozen in the chair, her eyes darting frantically between me and the approaching agents. She looked at the signed legal pad resting on my desk, her own handwriting sealing her ultimate doom. She had tried to execute the ultimate double cross and had walked blindly into her own execution. The federal agents hauled Chloe to her feet, the metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoing off the glass walls of my office. She did not scream or fight. The sheer magnitude of her own staggering stupidity had literally shocked her into a catatonic silence. I handed the yellow legal pad to my lead attorney, who immediately bagged it in a clear plastic folder as Exhibit A. With Chloe and Marcus both facing imminent federal indictments, the grand illusion of the untouchable Wilson dynasty was completely annihilated. Their carefully curated house of cards had finally collapsed. But delusions die hard, and my family had one final desperate card they believed would save them from total ruin. 3 days later, I walked into the plush mahogany-paneled office of Sterling & Vance, the premier probate law firm in the city. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, sealing me inside the expansive conference room with the remnants of my fractured family. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive leather floor wax and raw, unadulterated desperation. Richard stood by the window overlooking the financial district, his posture rigid and defensive. Evelyn sat in a high-backed chair, miraculously recovered from her theatrical patio heart attack, clutching a designer tissue in her lap. Marcus sat beside her, looking incredibly haggard. He had managed to post a heavily leveraged bail just hours prior, draining the last of his accessible liquidity. His custom suit hung loosely on his frame, and the dark purple circles under his eyes betrayed his absolute panic. Yet despite facing decades in a federal penitentiary, his chin was tilted upward. They were cornered rats, but they were banking everything on this single meeting. They were here for the unsealing of Grandmother Dorothy's estate. For months, Richard had hyped up this inheritance as the ultimate safety net, the impenetrable family vault that would protect them from any financial or legal disaster. The ancestral land alone was worth tens of millions to commercial developers. They desperately needed that liquid capital to fight the federal fraud charges, to unfreeze their assets, and to hire the kind of defense attorneys who could keep Marcus out of a jumpsuit. They fully expected Grandmother to deliver their salvation from the grave. Richard turned away from the window as I took my seat at the far end of the long, polished table. He sneered, his eyes raking over my tailored charcoal suit with undisguised contempt. He still believed he held the upper hand. He still believed the patriarchal hierarchy of this family would ultimately crush my independence. "You are wasting your time showing up here," Maya Richard stated, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. Mom always knew Marcus was the star of this family. She knew he was the only one capable of carrying the legacy forward. She is leaving the ancestral land to him. He walked toward the table, leaning over and placing both hands flat on the polished wood to emphasize his authority. "Once we sell it, we will have enough liquid capital to bury your petty little lawsuits and pay off the feds. We will squash you in court. You will be left with absolutely nothing, and you will finally learn your place." I did not say a word. I simply folded my hands in my lap and maintained a flat, impassive expression. I knew Grandmother Dorothy better than any of them. While they were busy performing for her at holiday dinners, pretending to be the perfect high society family, I was the one sitting with her on the back porch listening to her sharp, ruthless observations. She saw through all their posturing. Mr. Sterling, an elderly attorney with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat loudly to command the room. He picked up the heavy ivory envelope bearing Grandmother's unbroken crimson wax seal. With a sharp silver letter opener, he sliced through the top and extracted the thick parchment documents. "Let us begin," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dry and professional. He adjusted his glasses on the bridge of his nose and began reading the preamble of the will. "I, Dorothy Eleanor Wilson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this my final will and testament. To my son Richard, I acknowledge your relentless ambition. To my grandson Marcus, I acknowledge your undeniable charm and your ability to captivate a room. You have both always possessed a remarkable talent for making people believe exactly what you want them to believe." Marcus let out a loud, arrogant breath, leaning back in his leather chair and crossing his arms behind his head. A smug, triumphant grin spread across his haggard face. He shot me a venomous look of pure, unadulterated victory. Evelyn patted his knee, her face glowing with intense maternal pride. Richard puffed out his chest, his aggressive posture fully validated by his mother's words from beyond the grave. They were already spending the money in their minds, calculating exactly how they would use it to destroy me. Mr. Sterling turned to the second page. I watched his eyes scan the next paragraph. He stopped abruptly. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The healthy pink color drained completely from his weathered cheeks, leaving him a pale, sickly gray. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick parchment paper rustled audibly in the dead quiet room. "Read it." Sterling Richard barked, his patience instantly evaporating. "Stop stalling and read the distributions." Mr. Sterling swallowed hard, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. He looked at Richard with a complex mixture of profound pity and absolute terror. He cleared his throat again, his voice now shaking noticeably, as he read the words Grandmother had left behind. "To my son, Richard, and grandson Marcus, I have watched you steal, lie, and disrespect the backbone of this family for decades. I have watched you manipulate the weak and punish the strong. Therefore, I leave the ancestral land, the accounts, and the entirety of my estate to the only one with the brains and integrity to protect it, Maya." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the suffocating silence of a bomb dropping, wiping out their reality. But Mr. Sterling was not finished. He read the final paragraph, his voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. "Furthermore, any attempt by Richard or Marcus to contest this, will immediately trigger the automatic release of a private dossier I compiled and entrusted to my attorneys. This dossier details 20 years of Richard's corporate embezzlement from the family holdings. You will accept this decision, or you will join your son in federal prison. Despite the crushing absolute defeat at the probate lawyer's office, Marcus possessed the survival instincts of a cornered rat. With the federal investigation tightening like a noose, and grandmother Dorothy's entire estate legally ripped from his grasp, he was utterly starved for liquid capital. His defense attorneys required massive retainers just to keep him out of a federal holding cell. He needed millions, and he needed them immediately. His sheer desperation led him to the one place where his manufactured charm and fabricated narratives could still be weaponized for rapid cash: the municipal government. The downtown city council chamber was packed to absolute capacity. The harsh fluorescent lights gleamed off the polished mahogany dais where the mayor and 12 elected council members sat overlooking the gallery. The room was buzzing with the electric tense energy of local politics. On the docket was a highly contested $20 million municipal contract for the Southside Urban Revitalization Project. Marcus was playing his final, most audacious card to secure his own survival. He stood at the center podium, perfectly styled in a conservative navy blue suit that conveyed humble professionalism rather than his usual aggressive wealth. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone with a practiced, earnest expression. He was delivering the performance of a lifetime. He wove a masterful, charismatic narrative about his roots and his deep commitment to the city. He positioned himself not as a disgraced fraudster, but as a local champion of the people. He spoke passionately about being a Black-owned family business, standing as the ultimate bulwark against predatory corporate gentrification. He leaned heavily on powerful phrases like community empowerment, minority, uplift, and generational wealth building. He projected the flawless image of a selfless leader willing to sacrifice his own profit margins to ensure the neighborhood remained in the hands of the people who actually built it. It was sickeningly effective. The council members nodded along, completely captivated by the emotional weight of his delivery. They saw an easy political victory. Awarding the $20 million contract to Marcus looked fantastic on paper. It checked every progressive box and guaranteed favorable press for the upcoming election cycle. They were entirely oblivious to the federal raid that had recently gutted his offshore accounts or the shattered family legacy he had left behind. They only saw the polished, inspiring facade he presented. Marcus finished his speech with a humble bow of his head, stepping back from the microphone to a wave of enthusiastic applause from his planted supporters in the front row. The mayor adjusted his glasses, offering Marcus a warm, appreciative smile. The outcome was virtually guaranteed. The mayor leaned into his microphone, his voice echoing through the chamber. He praised Marcus for his unwavering dedication to the city and formally moved to bring the contract to a final vote. He asked the standard procedural question, inquiring if there were any final public comments before the council cast their official decisions. The chamber fell quiet. Marcus was already unbuttoning his suit jacket, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he had just secured $20 million of taxpayer money to fund his legal defense and rebuild his empire. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber swung open with a loud, definitive thud. Every head in the room turned. I stepped through this doorway holding a thick, heavily tabbed leather binder. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor as I walked straight down the center aisle. I did not rush. I moved with absolute calculated precision. The confident smirk on Marcus' face vanished instantly, replaced by a pale, rigid mask of terror. He gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles turning white as he stared at me in disbelief. I reached the public podium, adjusting the microphone to my height. I did not look at my brother. I directed my gaze entirely at the mayor and the seated council members. I introduced myself clearly, my voice projecting crisp and authoritative across the silent room. I acknowledged the powerful, moving speech the council had just heard. I noted how beautifully Marcus had spoken about uplifting minorities and protecting the vulnerable working class. Then I dropped the hammer. Mr. Marcus talks a very good game about uplifting minorities. I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. Yet I hold the audited financial records, showing he has not paid his black and brown subcontractors in 3 years. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The mayor leaned forward, his brow furrowed in sudden sharp alarm. Marcus jumped out of his seat, his face flushed with panicked rage. He shouted into the chamber, calling me a liar and a disgruntled relative trying to ruin a legitimate business deal. The mayor slammed his gavel, demanding immediate order. I simply smiled, ignoring his outburst completely. I detailed his exact methodology to the horrified council. I explained how he deliberately hired local minority-owned plumbing, electrical, and construction outfits to fulfill his diversity quotas for lucrative city bids. Once he secured the contracts, he funneled the city funds into his private holding accounts and completely cut off payments to the very people doing the manual labor. He systematically starved them out, forcing small family businesses into bankruptcy, while he kept the taxpayer money for his own lavish lifestyle. He hired them, bankrupted them, and walked away clean. I walked forward, stepping away from the podium, and placed the heavy leather binder directly onto the mayor's desk. I turned back to look directly into Marcus' terrified eyes. I am not just a concerned citizen, bringing this to the council's attention, I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling finality. I am the owner of the private equity firm that just bought out every single dime of those subcontractors' debts. We now hold the exclusive legal rights to their claims, and we are filing a massive class action lawsuit against him in the federal courthouse right now. The heavy leather binder hit the mayor's desk with a resounding thud. The entire city council chamber erupted into absolute pandemonium. The mayor scrambled backward in his high-backed leather chair, his eyes darting frantically over the first few pages of the audited records. He saw the devastating proof of the bankruptcies, the unpaid invoices, the forged lien releases, and the diverted municipal funds. The political liability sitting in his hands was practically radioactive. He struck his wooden gavel repeatedly against the sound block, demanding order, but the gallery was already in an uproar. Local reporters in the back row were frantically typing on their phones, broadcasting the collapse of the city's most anticipated municipal deal in real time. The mayor leaned into his microphone, his voice trembling with furious urgency. He formally declared the $20 million contract immediately and permanently revoked, pending a full municipal and federal investigation. Marcus did not wait for the gavel to strike a second time. The manufactured charisma completely melted off his face, leaving nothing but the raw, frantic panic of a trapped animal. He spun around, shoving violently past the very community's supporters he had just pandered to, and sprinted up the center aisle. He hit the heavy wooden double doors with his shoulder, bursting out into the marble corridor of City Hall. Richard and Evelyn were right behind him. My parents scrambled out of their front row VIP seats, completely abandoning whatever dignity they had left. They chased after their golden boy, shouting his name, their designer shoes slipping on the polished floors. They were still fiercely, desperately trying to shield him from the consequences of his own actions. I took my time. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, picked up my briefcase, and walked calmly out of the chamber, leaving the local government officials to sort through the absolute wreckage of my brother's empire. I stepped out into the cool evening air, just as Marcus reached his illegally parked luxury SUV in the municipal lot. He was frantically yanking at the door handle, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his keys onto the asphalt. Evelyn saw me walking down the wide concrete steps and completely lost whatever fragile grip she had on her sanity. She abandoned Marcus and marched straight toward me, her face contorted into a mask of pure venomous hatred. She pointed a trembling manicured finger inches from my face. "Are you happy now?" she screamed, her voice echoing across the empty parking lot. "You have destroyed your brother. You have destroyed your own blood." Richard flanked her, nodding aggressively, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked ready to physically remove me from the premises. I stopped on the bottom step, looking down at the woman who had spent 30 years making me feel completely invisible. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her with clinical detachment. "I did not destroy him, Mom," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the cool night air. "His greed did. And your enabling handed him the shovel to dig his own grave. You fed his ego until he thought the law simply did not apply to him. You taught him that he could take whatever he wanted, and you would always clean up the mess. Well, I am not cleaning this up. Evelyn opened her mouth to shriek another defense of her golden boy, but the sound died in her throat. A faint, high-pitched wail cut through the evening silence. The sound of sirens in the distance was growing louder and moving incredibly fast. Marcus finally scooped his keys off the pavement, but before he could even unlock the driver's side door, 3 unmarked black SUVs tore into the parking lot. They mounted the curb, blocking the exit completely. Their red and blue dashboard lights flashed brightly against the brick exterior of the municipal building. The sirens blared momentarily before being abruptly cut off. Federal agents swarmed the asphalt, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. 2 agents flanked Marcus instantly. They slammed him against the hood of his own car, kicking his legs apart and forcing his hands behind his back. Marcus wailed, kicking and struggling, but the agents pinned him effortlessly. But the swarm did not stop there. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern, uncompromising face, walked right past my struggling brother and marched directly toward where my parents were standing. Richard instinctively stepped in front of Evelyn, puffing out his chest to demand an explanation. He still believed his status and his wealth afforded him untouchable privilege. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard barked, his face red with indignation. "You cannot just storm in here and assault my son. I am calling my attorneys." The agent did not even blink. He did not slow his pace. He reached right past Richard and grabbed Evelyn's wrist. "Richard and Evelyn Caldwell," he announced, his voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and tax evasion." My parents completely froze. The aggressive indignation evaporated from their faces, replaced by absolute, unadulterated terror. Richard stammered, taking a weak step backward. "There is some mistake," Richard gasped. "We have nothing to do with his business operations. We are just investors." The agent pulled a set of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "There is no mistake, Mr. Caldwell. Your signatures are on every single fraudulent corporate tax return Marcus filed for the last 5 years. You knowingly certified his laundered income as legitimate capital gains. You are fully complicit." Evelyn let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Her knees buckled and she would have collapsed onto the asphalt if the agent had not been holding her arm. She looked at Marcus, who was now securely cuffed and pressed against the hood of his car, weeping uncontrollably. She looked at Richard, who was staring blankly at his own hands as another agent secured them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the parking lot. It was the definitive sound of the Caldwell dynasty being permanently dismantled. 6 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing the fate of the entire family. The sprawling, high-ceilinged courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Reporters, investors, and former victims of the family enterprise filled every single bench in the gallery. The air was thick with the sterile heavy weight of impending justice. I sat calmly in the front row, watching the spectacle unfold at the defense tables. The contrast was staggering. 6 months ago, they had stood in a luxury penthouse radiating unearned superiority and absolute arrogance. Today they looked like hollowed-out shells of their former selves. They had been entirely stripped of their designer clothes, their offshore accounts, and their impenetrable shields of white privilege. Marcus sat at the primary defense table wearing a standard-issue tan prison jumpsuit. He had been denied bail after being deemed an extreme flight risk. His artificially whitened teeth were clenched, his posture completely slumped, and his hands were cuffed to a chain around his waist. Chloe sat at the adjacent table beside her court-appointed attorney. Her platinum blonde hair was flat and unwashed. She wore a cheap beige blouse and kept her head bowed, her eyes darting nervously around the room like a terrified rabbit. Richard and Evelyn sat at the third table. The imposing corporate patriarch and the country club matriarch were completely unrecognizable. Evelyn's expensive dye job had grown out, revealing stark white roots, and her hands trembled uncontrollably in her lap. Richard stared blankly at the polished wood of the defense table, his face sagging and gray. The federal asset forfeiture had drained every single cent they possessed, leaving them relying on public defenders to fight a completely unwinnable case. Despite the insurmountable mountain of audited evidence, their legal team decided to try one final desperate Hail Mary. During the designated time for final arguments, Marcus' lead attorney stood up and paced aggressively in front of the judge. He gestured wildly toward where I was sitting, attempting to execute the exact same gaslighting tactics my family had used for 3 decades. Your Honor, this entire federal case is nothing but the result of a vindictive, jealous sister, the attorney declared, his voice echoing loudly across the gallery. My client Marcus is a victim of a highly orchestrated, targeted setup. Maya harbored a lifelong resentment against her brother's immense success and her parents' natural preference for him. She weaponized city contracts and manipulated vulnerable subcontractors purely to destroy her own flesh and blood. She manufactured this crisis out of deep-seated spite, the gallery murmured, but the judge, a stern older woman with piercing eyes, simply stared the attorney down until he awkwardly returned to his seat. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to paint me as the villain. The judge turned her attention to the prosecution and asked if the victim wished to make a final impact statement before sentencing was formally handed down. I stood up, smoothing the lapels of my immaculate midnight blue suit. I did not feel a single drop of anxiety. I did not feel the familiar childhood panic that used to consume me whenever I was forced to speak in front of my father. I felt completely radiant, entirely calm, and absolutely untouchable. I walked down the center aisle and took my place at the wooden witness stand, adjusting the microphone. I looked directly at the defense tables. Marcus refused to meet my gaze. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut. Richard and Evelyn simply stared at me with wide, terrified expressions. My brother's attorney calls me jealous. I began, my voice ringing out clear and measured across the silent courtroom. He claims I orchestrated a massive setup to frame my family. But you cannot set up people who are already actively engaged in defrauding the federal government. You cannot force a man to bankrupt honest, hardworking subcontractors to fund his offshore accounts. You cannot force parents to knowingly sign fraudulent tax returns to protect their favorite child. I gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. For 30 years, my parents taught me that family loyalty meant absolute silence. I continued, looking directly at Evelyn. They demanded I accept relentless emotional abuse as a form of tough love. They enabled Marcus at every single turn, feeding his massive ego while systematically attempting to starve my independence. When Chloe acted as the sole signatory for their Delaware shell companies, she knew exactly whose livelihoods were being destroyed to pay for her luxury vacations. And when they all thought they had successfully locked me out of the family legacy, when they mocked my career and stole my inheritance, they genuinely believed their wealth made them untouchable. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the courtroom. I looked at the judge, holding her gaze with unwavering certainty. They called me a failure. I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality. They told me I was unfit, unloved, and unworthy because I did not fit their toxic narrative. But the truth is, I was never the black sheep. I was the mirror reflecting their own corruption. I did not ruin them. I simply handed them the bill for their own arrogance. I stepped down from the stand and walked back to my seat. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the defendants with profound, unfiltered disgust. She did not waste any time with pleasantries. She struck her heavy wooden gavel against the sound block. Marcus, your actions represent the absolute worst of corporate greed, the judge announced, her voice booming through the speakers. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Marcus let out a strangled, sobbing gasp, dropping his head onto the defense table. Chloe, you were a willing and active participant in this criminal enterprise, the judge continued. You are sentenced to 5 years of strict house arrest and ordered to pay $4 million in restitution fines. Chloe buried her face in her hands, weeping hysterically into her cheap beige blouse. Richard and Evelyn, the judge said, turning her harsh gaze to my parents. Because of your advanced age and your cooperation agreements, you will avoid federal prison. However, you are sentenced to 5 years of strict federal probation. Furthermore, you are forced into immediate and absolute bankruptcy. Every remaining asset, property, and offshore account is hereby seized by the federal government. Evelyn let out a loud, agonizing wail that pierced the quiet courtroom. Richard simply collapsed forward, looking like a man who had just had his very soul extracted from his body. The bailiffs immediately moved in, surrounding the defense tables to take Marcus into federal custody. The heavy clinking of chains filled the room as they pulled him to his feet. Maya Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with absolute pathetic desperation as they dragged him toward the side door. "Maya, please." Evelyn reached a trembling, desperate hand over the wooden partition. Her tear-streaked face turned toward me, pleading silently for a salvation she absolutely did not deserve. I stood up from the front row and picked up my leather briefcase. I did not stop. I did not turn my head. I did not offer a single word of comfort or acknowledge their suffering. I walked straight down the center aisle of the packed courtroom, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and stepped out into the bright, warm sunlight, leaving them entirely in the dark. 1 year later, the air felt entirely different. The stifling, oppressive atmosphere of the federal courthouse had been completely replaced by the crisp electric wind whipping across the Atlanta skyline. I stood at the edge of the glass parapet on the rooftop of the Sovereign. It was my newest and most ambitious development, yet a 50-story luxury boutique hotel situated right in the beating heart of the city's financial district. I rested my hands on the cool marble railing, letting my gaze sweep over the glittering urban landscape below. The building beneath my feet was a physical manifestation of my absolute independence. It was not financed by predatory loans, municipal fraud, or laundered offshore accounts. It was built entirely on the solid, unyielding foundation of my own relentless hard work and the pristine reputation I had cultivated over a decade. Every sleek architectural line, every curated piece of art in the lobby, every glowing review from the guests sleeping in the suites below belonged to me. I had manifested my own empire from the ashes of their destruction. A sharp buzz vibrated against the marble surface. I glanced down at my phone. A text message from an unknown number glowed brightly against the darkening screen. I did not need to see a saved contact name to know exactly who was contacting me. The preview text was frantic, erratic, and filled with desperate capitalization. It was Evelyn. The message was a pathetic, sprawling paragraph begging for an immediate wire transfer. She needed money to cover the rent on the cramped, rundown two-bedroom apartment she now shared with Chloe. She detailed the indignity of her federal probation, the humiliation of having her credit cards permanently declined, and the unbearable shame of buying groceries with cash. She cited her failing health. She invoked the concept of family duty. She pleaded with me, claiming that a daughter should never let her own mother face eviction regardless of past misunderstandings. I read the words with absolute clinical detachment. A year ago, a message like this might have made my heart race. A year ago, I might have felt a sickening twinge of conditioned guilt, a desperate urge to fix the problem, to earn a scrap of affection. Now I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional umbilical cord had been permanently severed. I did not type out a long response outlining my boundaries. I did not justify my refusal. I did not send a single cent to ease her self-inflicted misery. I simply tapped the screen, pressed delete, and selected block caller. The generational curse was officially and irrevocably broken. I tossed the phone onto a nearby lounge chair and picked up my flute of vintage champagne. Warm, genuine laughter drifted over from the private cabanas behind me. I turned around to look at the people who actually mattered. My chosen family was gathered around a long fire table, the flickering flames illuminating their smiling faces. Jordan, my brilliant, ruthless attorney, who had helped me systematically dismantle the Caldwell empire, was leaning against the outdoor bar. He was recounting a legal victory to my closest friends, his hands animating the story while they roared with appreciative laughter. My new partner stood beside him, pouring fresh drinks and ensuring everyone was taken care of. When he caught me looking, his face broke into a wide, genuine smile that radiated the kind of quiet, steady support I had never experienced growing up. He walked over and wrapped a warm arm around my waist, pressing a gentle kiss to my temple. There was no undercurrent of competition here. There was no toxic scorekeeping, no golden children, and no designated black sheep to absorb the blame. There was only authentic, earned mutual respect. Jordan noticed me walking back toward the group and raised his glass high into the evening air. The conversations immediately ceased, and the rest of my friends followed suit, raising their glasses in unison. They did not offer a toast to my wealth, my property portfolio, or my business acumen. They toasted to my peace. They toasted to my freedom. They celebrated the woman I had become despite every obstacle thrown in my path. I raised my flute in return, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the crisp champagne, feeling a profound sense of contentment settle deep into my bones. As the celebration continued, I stepped away from the fire table and walked back toward the edge of the roof. I looked out over the vast, glittering expanse of the city below me. The streets were filled with thousands of people rushing home, navigating their own silent battles, their own toxic family dynamics, their own invisible psychological cages. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs completely. I looked straight ahead, projecting my presence not just to the city, but to anyone who needed to hear the truth. To every woman who has ever been told she is too much, too quiet, or a massive disappointment by the very people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. Let them underestimate you. Let them call you a failure. Let them lock you out in the cold. Because the exact moment they shut their heavy wooden doors on you is the moment you are finally completely free to build your own kingdom. They called me a failure. They told me I was unfit, unloved, and unworthy because I did not fit their toxic narrative. But the truth is, I was never the black sheep. I was the mirror reflecting their own corruption. I did not ruin them. I simply handed them the bill for their own arrogance. Do not waste another second knocking on a door that was designed to keep you small. Turn around, walk away, build something they could never even dream of. And trust me, the view from the top is absolutely spectacular.